You never forget the sound of frozen branches snapping under the weight of silence. That kind of cold, it's not just in the air, it's inside your bones, behind your eyes. It settles in and stays. That December, the world was quieter than usual, like the earth itself was holding its breath. And then came the thunder. We were somewhere near a village called Bulge, though to be honest, the maps didn't mean much in those woods. Snow piled up so high it blurred the land into a blank page, and the trees, those damn pine trees, stood like sentinels, motionless, watching. We were just kids, really. I was 23, oldest in my squad. We joked about that, said I'd be getting a pension soon. But there wasn't much to laugh about once the artillery started. We'd been told the Germans were finished, tired, scattered, retreating. But I guess no one told them that. They hit us on the morning of December 16th. It started with a low rumble, distant, almost like thunder rolling through the ground. Then the horizon lit up. It was like sunrise, only it brought fire, not light. I remember seeing the guy next to me, Miller, from Ohio, just staring at the treetops glowing red. Didn't even duck. He couldn't believe it. Within minutes, shells were dropping everywhere. Snow exploded in huge geysers of earth and ice. I swear I saw one tree fly 20 feet into the air, spinning like a child's toy. We hit the ground, no formation, no plan, just instincts. I clawed into a snowbank, my rifle useless in my hands, while the sky came apart above us. There was something almost unreal about that first barrage, like watching someone else's war. The snow muffled the sound after the initial hits, but you could still feel the concussions. It was like your insides were being rearranged. And then just as fast as it began, it stopped. Silence again. That's when the fog crept in. I remember thinking it looked too perfect, like a movie set. The smoke from the shelling mixed with a morning mist, and suddenly we couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead. And then came the voices, low, clipped German, too close. They were already in our lines. We weren't ready. Not for that. The next few hours blurred into a frozen, red-tinted nightmare. I saw Jenkins, young kid from Mississippi, bayonet a man at such close range, he didn't even realize he'd been shot in the leg until after. We were fighting in 3s and 4s, dodging behind trees, ducking through ditches, turning snowbanks into foxholes. No front line, no rear, just chaos. I saw something then I've never told anyone. I still don't know if it was real or just my mind cracking open under the pressure. After we pushed a small German patrol out of a grove, I found myself alone for a moment, catching my breath behind a felled pine. And there, in the clearing, I saw a figure standing in the snow. He wore no helmet, no gear, just an old wool coat and boots. Looked like a farmer. His face was calm, too calm. He looked right at me and smiled. Then he was gone. No tracks in the snow. Nothing. I told myself it was the fog playing tricks. But even now, I'm not sure. By nightfall, we'd regrouped near a place the maps called Elsenborn Ridge. Command was scrambling, radios were jammed, and no one knew how far the Germans had pushed. We dug in under a frozen sky, trying to keep our rifles dry, our feet moving, our hands from going black. I remember hearing someone humming White Christmas from a nearby foxhole. It sounded more like a funeral dirge than a carol. The worst part wasn't the cold or the shelling or the bullets. It was not knowing. Not knowing who was alive, how far the enemy had come, whether the guy next to you would still be breathing in the morning. We took turns sleeping in 90-minute shifts. I didn't sleep, just stared at the treetops, waiting. There were rumors, of course. Whispers about German soldiers dressed as Americans. Saboteurs changing road signs, infiltrating command posts. That kind of talk spreads fast when you're cold and scared. One guy, Henderson from Chicago, swore he saw a jeep full of American MPs wave him down, then vanish into thin air. We laughed at him at first. Then someone found tire tracks that ended in the middle of the woods. By day 3, the snow had turned pink in places. Frozen blood. You stop noticing after a while. It becomes part of the scenery, like the ice on your sleeves or the numbness in your toes. On the 4th morning, they came again. This time in force. Tanks. Panzer columns moving through the trees like metal beasts. We weren't supposed to be able to stop them. But we did. Barely. Bazookas, grenades, Molotovs made from whatever we had left. We used the terrain, the trees, even our own dead as cover. I saw Daniels, quiet guy, never said much, run straight into the path of a Tiger tank with 2 satchel charges strapped to his chest. The explosion lifted the turret off its mount. He didn't survive, but neither did they. We held the ridge, somehow, but at a cost. That night, as the wind howled through the branches and the firelight from burning armor danced on the snow, I found myself thinking about home. About my old man's cigar smoke, my sister's voice on the porch, the way autumn leaves used to smell in upstate New York. Strange what your mind clings to when everything else is frozen or bleeding. Then came the sound, soft, rhythmic. Footsteps. Not many, just 1 or 2 pairs. I raised my rifle, breath clouding the air in front of me. But what stepped into view wasn't a soldier. It was a girl. A Belgian girl, no more than 12. Hair tangled, coat too big for her frame. She didn't say a word, just stared at me with eyes that didn't blink. And in her hands, she held something wrapped in cloth. She set it down in the snow, nodded once, and turned back into the trees. Inside the cloth bread, still warm. I didn't eat it. I didn't touch it. I just sat there, watching it steam the cold, while questions circled in my mind like vultures. Who was she? How did she find us? Why now? And more importantly, how did she survive the fire in the snow? The bread sat there for what felt like an hour, steam coiling up like smoke from a fading campfire, soft and deliberate, defiant against the surrounding cold that had turned our rations into bricks and our breath into mist. I didn't touch it. None of us did. I told myself it could be poisoned, a trap, some elaborate trick cooked up by the enemy to test our desperation. But the truth was simpler and far more disturbing. I didn't trust the moment. It was too human, too tender, too normal for a place that had become unrecognizable. In a landscape where every tree might hide a rifle and every second could be your last, kindness had become a ghost. And yet there was, wrapped in coarse cloth, real as blood and still warm from someone's hands. We didn't speak about the girl. Not that night, and not the next day either. Something about the way she appeared, no footsteps, no words, just those wide, glassy eyes, left a mark deeper than any bullet wound. Jenkins tried to joke about it, muttering something about ghost kids from the woods, but even he didn't laugh afterward. It was as if we all silently agreed to let that moment settle into the frozen dirt and forget it ever happened. But of course, you don't forget things like that. You just bury them, like so many bodies, and pray they don't rise back up. The next day was colder, somehow. We'd already lost the feeling in our fingers and toes days before, but this was different. It was a kind of cold that made your insides ache, like your bones were trying to retreat deeper into your body for warmth. Our unit had been pulled back half a mile to set up a temporary command post near the remnants of a farmhouse. Or maybe it had once been a barn. It was hard to tell, given that half the structure had been reduced to splinters by a mortar strike. The roof sagged inward like a wounded animal, and the air inside smelled of hay, gunpowder, and rot. It was shelter, though. By that point, we would have slept inside a crater if it meant being out of the wind for an hour. We were told to hold the line until reinforcements arrived from the 82nd Airborne. That was the official story. The reality was we were buying time. Nothing more. Just slowing the German advance long enough for someone higher up the chain to figure out a plan. Our radio operator, a wiry kid from Nebraska named Cullen, had been working non-stop to get through to HQ, but the weather, the terrain, and the enemy jammers meant we were mostly in the dark, cut off and buried alive in a sea of white and gray. It was on the second night in that ruin of a barn that the whispering began. I don't mean the kind that soldiers do when they think the lieutenant is asleep. I mean actual whispering. Low, hushed voices that seemed to come from inside the walls, just behind the timber, never quite loud enough to understand. At first, I figured it was exhaustion. Sleep deprivation does funny things to the mind, especially when your only nutrition comes from frozen crackers and slivers of chocolate you've saved from rations like they were holy relics. But then I noticed Jenkins sitting upright across from me, staring into the shadows like a man who'd just seen the face of God and wasn't sure whether to scream or laugh. I asked if he'd heard something. He didn't answer. He just nodded. Slowly. No one else brought it up the next morning. But I saw the signs. Daniels was sharpening his bayonet with a kind of absent-minded focus that looked more like self-defense than preparation. Cullen kept checking and rechecking the same 5 frequencies, even when we told him to rest. and I found myself watching the tree lean with new eyes, not for movement or muzzle flashes, but for her, the girl. Part of me expected her to come back. Part of me prayed she wouldn't. The attacks didn't let up. If anything, they intensified. The Germans had begun using the fog to their advantage, creeping up through the woods under cover of near invisibility, launching sudden strikes that left our nerves frayed and our defenses leaking blood. I watched one of our guys, Private Bell, quiet kid, too smart for war, get hit in the throat by a sniper round while taking a piss. He didn't even scream, just clutched at the wound like he was trying to hold his own voice inside and dropped face first into the snow. We couldn't even retrieve his body for 2 days. By now, the lines between days and nights had blurred into a single stretched-out loop of panic and fatigue. Time no longer moved forward. It circled us like vultures, watching, waiting. I don't remember how long we stayed in that position, 3 days, 5, maybe longer, but what I do remember is the smell. Not of the dead, though that was always present, faint and metallic like rusted meat. No, I mean smoke. Sweet, strange smoke, like someone burning pine needles and bread dough at the same time. It drifted through the trees at dusk, always just before the whispering started. And then we lost Cullen. One morning, he was just gone. No footprints, no scuffle, no sign of struggle. His gear was still there, rifle propped against the corner, radio headset lying coiled like a sleeping snake on the floor. We searched the perimeter, called his name until our voices cracked, even fired a few shots into the air hoping he'd hear and come running. Nothing. It was like the forest had swallowed him. That night, I dreamed of the girl again. But this time, she wasn't holding bread. She was kneeling in the snow, hands over her face, sobbing into her palms while blood pooled beneath her like a red halo. When I woke, my blanket was gone, my boots were soaked, and my hands were trembling. I didn't tell anyone. The next day brought another assault, this one more organized, more brutal. German infantry backed by half-tracks, moving in flanking patterns they had no right to know about. It was like they could feel our weaknesses before we even knew them ourselves. We fell back again, barely holding our wounded, dragging them through snow so deep it came up to our thighs in places. I remember carrying Jenkins after shrapnel caught him in the ribs. His blood steamed in the cold air as I pressed my shoulder under his arm and half-dragged, half-carried him through a grove of blackened trees that looked like they'd been scorched by lightning. He didn't speak. He just looked at me with that same wide stare, like he was already halfway gone. When we finally reached a new fallback position near Frozen Creek, I collapsed beside a stump and let my rifle fall to the ground. And there, just across the ice, I saw her again. This time, she was standing between 2 trees. The wind tugged at her coat, and her hair whipped across her face, but she didn't move, didn't blink. She just stood there, staring. And in her hands, God help me, she held Cullen's helmet. I stood up slowly, boots crunching on the frostbitten soil, my breath like smoke rising between us. I took a step forward. She turned and vanished into the fog. No footprints, just the sound of whispering, carried on the wind like a prayer or a curse. That was when I realized this wasn't just war. Something else was moving in those woods. Something older than borders, older than uniforms, older than the snow. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a battlefield after too many have died in too little time, a heavy, pressing quiet that isn't just the absence of sound, but the weight of what was lost and what still lingers. That silence had settled over us like a second snowfall, invisible but suffocating. We moved through the trees like ghosts ourselves, not speaking, not thinking, just doing what had to be done because the alternative was madness, and madness was already too close. The girl had not returned. Not that day, not the next. But her presence was like a splinter in the back of the mind, small, sharp, impossible to ignore. Some of the guys had started muttering about her in half-finished sentences, as if saying too much might make her real, like conjuring something that was better left undisturbed. And then there were those who wouldn't mention her at all. Daniels, for one, had become almost religious in his silence, clutching the small cross around his neck with such intensity that the chain had begun to cut into his skin. When I asked him once if he was all right, he just gave me a look I'd seen once before in a wounded man's eyes, a look of someone already too far gone to pull back. We had been moved again, this time to a sector farther west, near the outskirts of a small village whose name I never learned. The buildings were hollowed-out shells, stone walls half collapsed and scorched by artillery fire, roofs like shattered teeth biting into the sky. The The civilians had long since fled, or perhaps not. Sometimes at night we heard noises in the rubble. Not voices exactly, but movement. The kind of scraping and shifting that makes your instincts tighten like a fist, even when your rational mind tells you it's probably just the wind or a rat. But I'd stopped trusting my rational mind by then. It already failed me too many times. We dug in for another standoff, this time expecting a prolonged engagement, and while we waited, because in war, waiting is the default state of being, we tried to piece together what was left of our unit. Jenkins had taken a turn for the worse, infection setting into his side where the shrapnel had torn through. We had no morphine left and precious little clean water. Our medic had been killed in the last retreat, his kit scattered across a mind-blown trail that none of us dared cross to retrieve. So we did what we could with what we had, strips of uniform for bandages, melted snow for hydration, prayers whispered through clenched teeth as if they might stitch a body back together. Jenkins didn't complain. Not once. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling of the ruined house we'd taken shelter in, lips moving silently. When I leaned in to hear what he was saying, I realized it wasn't a prayer at all. It was a name. Emily. He repeated it over and over, almost rhythmically, like a lullaby. I never asked who she was. The snow kept falling, each flake a slow-motion bullet from the sky, and the trees continued to whisper things no one dared admit hearing. More than once I caught myself waking from a half-sleep with the distinct sensation that someone was standing nearby, just beyond my field of vision. Once, I swung my rifle up so fast I nearly shot Daniels in the leg. He didn't even flinch, just looked at me and nodded like he understood, like he'd done the same thing more times than he could count. The cold made everything harder, breathing, thinking, remembering who you were before all this. It dulled you, like rust on a blade, turning your edges into something quieter, more dangerous. I remember staring at my hands one night, knuckles split and bleeding, skin like cracked porcelain, and thinking that I could barely recognize them. They looked like someone else's hands. A stranger's. On the fourth night in that village, something changed. It started with the dogs. We hadn't seen or heard any animals for days. Most had fled or been eaten, but that night, just as the sun was setting behind a wall of ice-gray clouds, we heard a long, low howl echo through the hills. It wasn't close, but it was clear, carried by the wind with a clarity that felt unnatural. Then another joined it, and another. Within minutes, the sound became a chorus, howls and barks rising and falling like a kind of twisted symphony, and not a man among us could pretend it was normal. Jenkins sat up for the first time in days and said, without a hint of irony, "The dead are walking tonight." No one corrected him. In fact, no one said a word. We just listened until the sounds faded into nothing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear. I'd long since passed the point of fear. It was something else, an awareness, a pressure behind the eyes, like I was being watched by the woods themselves. I stood watch alone near the edge of the ruins, rifle resting on the broken frame of a window, eyes scanning the shadows that moved even when the wind did not. And then, without sound or warning, I saw her again. She was standing beneath a tree, no more than 15 yards away. Same coat, same too-thin frame, same expressionless face. But this time, she wasn't holding anything. Her arms hung loosely at her sides, palms turned upward. And behind her, just barely visible through the mist, stood a figure. Not a soldier. Not a civilian. A man tall, thin, wrapped in a tattered Wehrmacht overcoat that billowed slightly despite the still air. His face was obscured, but I knew, somehow I knew, he was looking directly at me. My mouth went dry. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just watched. And then the girl raised her hand and pointed to the east. No words. No expression. Just that slow, deliberate movement, like she was directing me to somewhere I didn't want to go. I turned to grab Daniels just for a second, and when I looked back, they were gone. I don't know why I followed the direction she pointed. Maybe it was madness, maybe something deeper. Some ancient instinct that hadn't been eroded by training and orders and fear. I moved carefully through the snow, away from our post, into a dense copse of trees where the moonlight barely filtered through. I must have walked 50, maybe 70 yards before I saw it, buried beneath the snow, covered with branches and bits of charred canvas, an American soldier, dead, face down, frostbite clinging to his exposed hand like ash. I rolled him over. It was Cullen. His eyes were still open. and in his frozen fingers, clenched so tightly it took everything I had to pry them loose, was a piece of cloth, coarse, simple, torn at the edges. It was the same cloth the girl had used to wrap the bread. I stared down at him, breath catching in my throat, not from grief, but from the impossible understanding that began to unfold in my mind like frost spreading across glass. She wasn't just wandering the woods. She was showing us, guiding. But why? And what was she guiding us toward? The questions burned hotter than any fire we'd kindled in that godforsaken place. I returned to the post just before dawn, carrying Cullen's body over my shoulder like a bag of shattered bones, and when Daniel saw me, he didn't ask what happened. He just said, "She's coming back." And this time, he didn't sound afraid. I've often heard people say that in war, you get used to the dying, that eventually the shock dulls, the smell becomes normal, and the sight of a man without a face no longer claws at your gut. That's a lie. The truth is, you don't get used to it, you adapt to survive it. You compartmentalize, wrap your horror in sandbags of routine and dark humor, and pray the dam holds just long enough to see another dawn. But even the strongest dam begins to crack when the world around it starts whispering things that have no place in a war fought by men. And by the time we buried Cullen's body under a crude cross made of broken rifle stocks, something inside me had shifted. I no longer questioned whether the girl was real. I no longer wondered what we were seeing. I had stopped trying to make sense of it. Because war teaches you one absolute lesson above all others. Reality bends under pressure, and in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, it had begun to shatter. We hadn't seen a German patrol in over 30 hours. The air had gone strangely still, heavy, like the moment just before a thunderclap. Our orders had changed again, typical chaos. We were to hold our current position for another 24 hours and then move northwest toward Bastogne, where the fighting had reportedly turned into something feral. They needed reinforcements, bodies to plug holes, to buy time with blood. The irony didn't escape any of us. Every day we lasted out here meant someone else might make it through the Bulge alive. But none of us believed reinforcements were really coming. We were the reinforcements. We were the last thread in a fraying rope, and we could feel it pulling apart beneath our boots. That night, I volunteered to take watch again. It wasn't bravery. I couldn't sleep anymore. Not with the images in my mind, the girl's eyes pale and fixed, Cullen's frozen grip, the silent figure in the trees. They had carved themselves into me like initials on a tombstone. So I stood my post beside the skeletal remains of a burned-out truck, its engine block still smelling faintly of oil and cordite. The stars were visible that night for the first time in weeks, scattered across the sky like cracks in some cosmic dome, and I found myself staring at them too long, wondering if anyone out there, far beyond the noise of earthbound violence, had any idea what was happening in this tiny snow-choked corner of Belgium. Then I heard it again. Not the whispering. Footsteps. Soft at first, like someone treading carefully across a floor they didn't belong on, then louder, crunching snow and twigs with deliberate weight. I didn't move, didn't raise my weapon. Something told me I shouldn't. I just waited, heart punching at my ribs, breath low and steaming. The sound stopped behind me. I turned slowly, expecting to see the girl, or maybe worse, nothing at all. But it was Jenkins, or what was left of him. He was standing upright for the first time in days, one hand pressed to the bandage on his side, his face pale and hollow. His eyes weren't wild, though. They were clear, calm. He looked at me and said one thing. She showed me. Then he collapsed. We dragged him back to the fire, unwrapped his bandages, and saw something none of us could explain. The wound, infected and reeking of decay just hours earlier, was clean, not healed, not gone, but somehow no longer festering. The skin around it had turned almost translucent, veins dark like ink under glass, but the rot was absent. Our remaining medic, a kid named Toller who'd only seen one semester of pre-med before the draft pulled him into hell, stared at it like he was looking at a riddle etched into flesh. He kept muttering, "This isn't how the body works," over and over like he was trying to convince himself. I didn't argue. I just watched Jenkins sleep, his chest rising and falling slow, steady, peaceful. The next day, we began finding the others. Not from our unit, but scattered bodies, American, German, civilians, some buried beneath collapsed walls, others frozen in unnatural poses as if death had come mid-sentence. But it wasn't just the presence of the dead that disturbed us. It was their eyes. Every single one of them stared up at the sky, pupils wide, expressions caught somewhere between awe and terror. Daniels found a priest among the rubble of a chapel, his mouth stuffed with pages from a Bible, fingers wrapped tightly around a crucifix melted by heat that hadn't touched the rest of his body. We didn't say anything. We just covered him with his own coat and moved on. By nightfall, the fog returned, thicker than before, as if the woods were trying to seal us in. It crept between the trees like a living thing, curling around boots and rifles, muting sound until even our own breathing felt distant. And somewhere in that quiet, the girl came again. She didn't approach this time. She stood at the edge of a field just beyond our camp, lit faintly by the dull glow of our fire, her hands clasped in front of her like she was waiting to speak at a funeral. Her coat fluttered gently in the wind, and for a moment she looked so ordinary, so painfully human that Daniels whispered, "Maybe she's lost. Maybe she need help." But we knew better. Behind her, shapes began to form. At first, just outlines, indistinct, blurry, like figures moving behind a curtain of fog. Then clear. Soldiers. Dozens of them. Their uniforms were a patchwork of history. German tunics with French insignia, American helmets on Soviet bodies, faces that didn't belong to any single time or place. They stood silently, shoulder to shoulder, eyes glowing faintly in the dark, not from light, but from something inside. And then one stepped forward. I don't know who he was, but I recognize him. Every soldier knows the face of fear when it's worn too long. The man before us bore that mask with perfection. His skin was drawn tight over bone, mouth twisted in something that wasn't quite pain but wasn't peace either. And in a voice so quiet it barely rippled the air, he said, "She's not showing you the past." We stood frozen, breath locked in our chests. "She's showing you what's coming." Then he turned and vanished into the mist, followed by the others, their forms dissipating like smoke and wind. And the girl? She remained, staring at us with those same bottomless eyes, until the fog swallowed her too. No one spoke for the rest of the night. Not one word. We just sat around the fire, listening to the wind pass through the pines, trying to convince ourselves that the world still worked the way it had before this all began. But deep down, each of us felt it, the shift, as if reality had been peeled back just enough to glimpse the machinery behind it, and what we saw didn't belong to men or war or history. We slept in shifts, but none of us really rested. And when the first light of dawn crept through the trees, tinged with red like blood and snow, we found Daniel sitting upright, eyes wide open, frost clinging to his lashes like tiny needles. He wasn't breathing, but his lips were parted, like he had just spoken, or was about to. We leaned in, and there, barely audible, came one word: "Run." By the time we wrapped Daniels in a tarp and laid him in the shallow, snow-covered trench just behind the ruins, none of us could look each other in the eyes for more than a few seconds. There's a kind of understanding that passes between soldiers who've seen too much, a silent contract that says, "We won't speak of this, not because we're cowards, but because speaking it aloud makes it real." And none of us wanted what was happening to be real. Not anymore. Jenkins had stopped asking questions. He simply followed me wherever I went, his face blank, his mouth never quite closing, as if still whispering her name in some silent, looping litany. Toller had all but shut down, burying himself in what supplies remained, tending to non-existent wounds, pretending he still understood medicine as it applied to the human body. I think he knew it didn't anymore. Not out here, not since the girl began showing us the things we weren't meant to see. After Daniel's final word, "Run," something changed in the air. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was inevitability. Like we were standing on the shore watching a tidal wave rise slowly over the horizon, powerless to move, unable to blink. Every sound became sharper. The wind through the pines no longer whispered. It moaned, low and animalistic. The crunch of snow under our boots echoed too long, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. There were fewer birds, fewer animals. Even the dogs that had once howled in the distance had gone silent. The world had begun to contract, pulling us towards some unseen center, and each step forward felt heavier, as if gravity itself was thickening. Orders finally came through by radio, scratchy and half-eaten by static, but clear enough. We were to fall back to the northern edge of Bastogne, regroup with elements of the 101st. A column would be waiting. A way out. Maybe. The voice on the other end sounded distant, unsure, like whoever was speaking had already seen too much themselves and was trying not to let it bleed through. I didn't trust it. None of us did. But it was movement, and movement, even in the wrong direction, was better than standing still in the teeth of something ancient and watching. We packed what we could, left what we had to, and started toward the tree line. The girl was there, just beyond the last burnt farmhouse, standing at the edge of the woods, waiting. Her face wasn't blank anymore. It was weary, sad, as though even she had grown tired of what was coming. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest, and for the first time she seemed smaller, almost human. I wanted to ask her something. I don't know what, but before I could step toward her, she turned and disappeared into the trees, gliding more than walking, her feet barely brushing the snow. And we followed. We didn't speak about it. We didn't even look at each other. We just moved in the direction she had gone, as if every fiber of our being had already decided there was no other choice. The woods swallowed us within minutes. The snow thickened. The trees leaned inward, branches bare and reaching like fingers trying to hold us back or guide us forward. It was impossible to tell. The deeper we moved, the darker it became, not because of nightfall, but as though the very light above had thinned, stretched too far over too much grief. Somewhere to the west, we could hear distant artillery, the hollow, faraway thud of a war still pretending to make sense. But here, under this canopy of frostbitten limbs and silence, it felt as if we'd stepped beyond the map, beyond the war, into something older. And then we saw them. The soldiers. Dozens of them, strung like broken marionettes from the trees, their bodies frozen stiff, uniforms from different nations and decades, their eyes wide and watching. Some had nooses. Some were impaled. One, still clutching a flare gun in his stiff hand, dangled just feet above our heads. No blood. No wounds. Just silence. We didn't stop. We didn't react. We couldn't. To acknowledge what we were seeing might shatter the last thread holding us to the world we'd left behind. So we kept walking. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time had become a cruel thing here, folding and stretching like smoke and wind. We reached a clearing near what must have once been a chapel, though now it was no more than two walls and a blackened stone altar cracked down the center. And there, at the foot of that ruin, the girl waited again. But this time, she wasn't alone. They stood behind her, shoulder to shoulder, the soldiers we'd seen before. All of them. The ones from different wars. The ones who didn't belong to this timeline or battlefield. They stood not like men, but like monuments, unmoving, eyes glowing faintly in the growing twilight. And behind them, the figure, taller than the rest, wearing that same tattered Wehrmacht coat, face still shrouded, presence like gravity. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But the cold deepened around him, sharp and suffocating, as if the air itself recoiled in his presence. And the girl, she stepped forward. And for the first time, she spoke. "You are not the last," she said, her voice soft and distant, like a lullaby carried over snow. "But you will remember." The world pulsed around us just once, a soundless ripple that passed through our bones, through the earth beneath our feet, through the war raging miles away. And suddenly I understood. These soldiers, they weren't ghosts. They weren't memories. They were echoes, the remnants of those who had been consumed by this forest, this winter, this thing. Men who had been devoured not by bullets or bombs, but by the weight of what they had seen, by the knowledge that there are places in the world where war becomes something else, where death isn't the end, but a beginning, a door. And we had stepped through it. Jenkins collapsed to his knees, tears freezing on his cheeks, whispering Emily's name over and over. Toller began to laugh, a broken, high-pitched sound that echoed too loud in the stillness. I felt my legs weaken, not from fear, but from understanding. We weren't meant to survive this place. That was never the point. We were meant to witness it, to carry its truth back into the world so that others might never return. But the price of witnessing is never being whole again. The girl stepped toward me, close now. Close enough that I could see the frost blooming in her hair, the hollow beneath her eyes, the small scar above her lip. She looked at me the way a mother looks at a child about to touch a flame. And then, without a word, she reached out and pressed something into my hand. A locket, old, rusted, American. Inside, the photograph of a man in uniform, smiling, and beneath it a name, mine. She looked up at me, and I understood. I had died here before, or I would again. Or maybe I was already dead, and this was the long echo of memory trying to reconcile what could not be undone. The sky opened above us. No stars, no clouds, just white. Blinding, infinite. And then, nothing. When I awoke, I was in a field hospital near Bastogne, wrapped in blankets, my hand bandaged. A nurse leaned over me, smiling too gently, asking if I could speak. They told me I'd been found wandering alone, half frozen, muttering about snow and trees and silence. My dog tags were gone. My rifle missing. No record of Jenkins. No trace of Toller. No unit listed in the area I claimed to be from. Just my name, my file, my rank, nothing else. I still have the locket. Still feel its weight. Some nights I wake up sweating, the sound of wind and pine trees echoing in my ears. The faint image of a girl standing at the edge of a battlefield burned behind my eyes. I never went back, but I still remember, because she made sure I would. And some things, once seen, can never be unseen.